April 17th, 1943. 27,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. Second Lieutenant Frank Murphy feels the B-17's yoke shudder in his gloved hands as tracer rounds slice past the cockpit windscreen. The glass is already spiderwebbed from a cannon shell that came within inches of his co-pilot's skull. Through the cracked plexiglass, Murphy watches three Focke-Wulf 190s roll into attack position, their yellow cowlings bright against the steel-grey clouds. He keys his throat mic. Fighters, 12 o'clock level. Here they come again. The B-17F Yankee Doodle is 38 minutes into its bombing run over the Bremen shipyards when the Luftwaffe's JG-1 fighter wing finds the formation. Staff Sergeant Bill Chen, hunched in the ball turret beneath the bomber's belly, rotates his twin .50 caliber machine guns toward the lead FW-190. The German pilot, Lieutenant Klaus Hoffmann of 1/JG-1, has already made 2 passes, putting rounds into Yankee Doodle's No. 3 engine and punching holes the size of dinner plates through the aluminum skin of the fuselage. Chen watches Hoffmann's fighter grow larger in his gun sight, the 20mm cannons in its wings beginning to strobe with muzzle flashes. The engagement happens in heartbeats. Hoffmann's cannon shells walk across Yankee Doodle's right wing, erupting in orange bursts that peel back metal like paper. Chen's twin 50s hammer back, spent casings bouncing against the turret's curved walls. A line of tracers connects the 2 aircraft for perhaps 2 seconds before Hoffmann breaks left, diving away. Chen doesn't see whether he scored hits. He's already tracking the next fighter. In the cockpit, Murphy fights the controls as the B-17 lurches from the cannon strikes. The No. 3 engine, already trailing black smoke, now streams flame from its cowling. Murphy's co-pilot, First Lieutenant James Kowalski, reaches for the fire suppression handle without being told. The halon system dumps its load into the engine nacelle. The flames die, replaced by more smoke. "Feather 3, Murphy says, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Kowalski pulls the propeller pitch control, and the dead engine's prop blades rotate to minimal drag position, their tips still. Behind the cockpit, in the bomber's narrow waist section, Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes fires burst after burst from his right waist gun position. The slipstream tears at his heated flight suit through the open gun port, the temperature at altitude sitting at 40 degrees below zero. Hayes watches another FW-190 make its run from the bomber's vulnerable 6 o'clock position, but before he can draw a bead, the tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, opens up. Rodriguez's twin 50s send a stream of armour-piercing incendiaries into the German fighter's flight path. The FW-190 pulls up hard, breaking off the attack. Hoffmann circles wide for another pass, his altitude advantage giving him time to assess the damage. Through his gun sight, he can see the American bomber's smoking engine, the visible holes in its fuselage, the ragged gaps in the wing where his cannon shells found their mark. By all logic and experience, this bomber should be falling from formation, beginning its death spiral toward the German countryside below. Hoffmann has flown combat missions since 1940. He's seen Heinkels and Dorniers go down with far less battle damage. Yet the B-17 holds its position in the formation, its prop still turning, its gun still firing. He arms his cannon and begins his third attack run. Hoffmann's third attack comes from 2 o'clock high, a classic bounce designed to catch the bomber's top turret gunner by surprise. But the top turret, manned by Staff Sergeant Thomas Dutch Vanderbilt, has been tracking German fighters across the entire sky for the past 12 minutes. The moment Hoffmann's silhouette crosses into Vanderbilt's firing arc, the twin 50s erupt. The sound is deafening even inside the pressurized cabin, a jackhammer rhythm that vibrates through the B-17's aluminum skin. Vanderbilt walks his tracers across the FW-190's fuselage, and this time he sees strikes, bright flashes of impact that bloom along the German fighter's cowling. Hoffmann's right wing drops suddenly, involuntarily. his hydraulic system has been hit. The FW-190 wallows through the sky like a wounded animal, bleeding control fluid that freezes instantly in the stratospheric cold. Hoffmann manages to regain partial control and peels away from the formation, limping eastward toward occupied France. He will make it back to his airfield at Wevelgem, but his fighter is done for the day. As he descends through the cloud deck, something crystallizes in Hoffmann's mind, a realization that will be repeated in interrogation reports and pilot debriefs across the Luftwaffe in the months to come. I hit that bomber with everything I had. We all did, and it's still flying. Back aboard Yankee Doodle, the formation presses on toward the target. Murphy has already made the decision. The B-17 will continue to bomb. 4 engines or 3, smoking or not, the mission comes first. He glances at Kowalski. Check the damage report. Over the next 20 minutes, as the formation approaches Bremen, the damage assessment comes back in pieces. Tail gunner Rodriguez reports a 3-foot hole in the vertical stabilizer. Waist gunners Hayes and Private First Class Donald Carmichael confirm over 200 bullet and cannon holes in the fuselage alone, so many that sunlight streams through the skin in places, casting strange striped shadows across the bomb bay. The number 3 engine is a total loss. The number 4 engine is running hot, oil temperature climbing into the red zone. The hydraulic system in the right wing has sustained damage. They may not have full flap extension on landing. And yet, when Murphy engages the autopilot and begins the bombing run, the B-17's flight path remains true. At 11:47 a.m. local time, Bombardier Captain William Teagle releases Yankee Doodle's payload, 4,000 pounds of high-explosive ordnance intended for the Deschimag shipyards. Through the bomb site, Teagle watches the ordnance streak downward through the flat clouds, the black puffs of anti-aircraft fire blooming all around the formation, like malevolent flowers. The bombs themselves are small from this height, but their trajectory is true. Teagle knows where they'll land. He knows even now at 27,000 feet that he's just contributed to the destruction of German naval construction capacity. The flak intensifies as the formation turns off the bomb run. These aren't the scattered bursts of early war German air defences. These are the coordinated salvos of a nation fighting for survival. Shells explode in precise patterns, their fragmentation clouds expanding to fill cubic miles of sky. In the ball turret, Chen sees one burst bloom directly below him, so close that the concussion rocks the entire bomber. He's certain the bomb bay has been hit. He's certain they've taken fatal damage. But Yankee Doodle flies on. By the time the formation leaves German airspace, heading back across the North Sea toward England, the B-17 has absorbed an estimated 500 bullet and cannon shell strikes. The number 2 engine has begun to overheat. The fuselage is a sieve. The right landing gear has sustained damage. Murphy won't know if it will lower and lock until he attempts to extend it. And yet, as Murphy looks across the formation toward the other B-17s, he sees the same pattern repeated. The bomber next to him, Memphis Belle, is trailing fluid from one engine and shows a gaping hole in its nose section. Behind and below, another B-17 is missing pieces of its vertical stabilizer. The entire formation is broken and bleeding, yet every single bomber is heading home. In fighter bases across occupied France and Belgium, Luftwaffe pilots file their after-action reports. They will describe what they witnessed with a mixture of frustration and something approaching awe. Klaus Hoffmann, his own FW-190 crippled, will write that the American bombers possessed an almost supernatural durability. Other pilots will use words like impossible and unbelievable. By day's end, the reports will filter up through the chain of command to Luftwaffe High Command, where strategists and engineers will begin asking uncomfortable questions. How do we shoot down aircraft that refuse to die? The B-17's legendary durability wasn't accident. It was engineered. When the Fortress first entered production in 1937, American designers at Boeing had a singular obsession: build a bomber that could absorb punishment and still returned to base. The result was revolutionary. Unlike the German bombers of the era, the Heinkel He 11-1 and Dornier Do-17, which prioritised speed and range over protection, the B-17 was designed as a flying tank. Its fuselage was constructed from a semi-monocoque aluminum structure with redundant internal bracing. The wing spars were massive, cross-braced with internal girders that distributed stress across multiple load paths. If one structural element failed, the bomber had backup systems already in place, but structure alone couldn't explain what German pilots were witnessing. The real advantage lay in systems redundancy. A Luftwaffe fighter pilot trained to attack bombers understood one thing: take out an engine and the bomber limped. Take out two engines on the same side and the bomber could no longer maintain formation. The B-17 had 4 engines. More importantly, each engine could operate independently. The hydraulic systems that controlled the flaps, landing gear, and flight surfaces were distributed across multiple circuits. Damage to one system didn't cascade into catastrophic failure. The fuel system itself was compartmentalized. A single hole wouldn't empty all the tanks. German bombers, by contrast, were often brought down by single well-placed cannon shells that ruptured critical systems. Then there was armour. The B-17 carried nearly half a ton of protective plating, specially hardened steel, positioned to shield the pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, and flight engineer from machine gun fire. No German bomber of the era carried comparable protection. Luftwaffe designers had made a different calculus. Speed was survival. A faster bomber could outrun fighters. But over Germany, surrounded by hundreds of interceptors, speed proved insufficient. The B-17's armour meant that even when German fighters achieved perfect firing passes, they often failed to kill the crew. On April 17, 1943, as Yankee Doodle limped back across the North Sea, Second Lieutenant Murphy was acutely aware of every one of these design features. His bomber had been hit repeatedly, yet it remained controllable. The damaged No. 3 engine had been feathered, but numbers 1, 2 and 4 continued to turn over. The hydraulic damage was localised. He still had full control authority through the backup systems. The fuselage was perforated, but the main structure held integrity. This was not luck. This was engineering. The flight back to England took 3 hours. 3 hours of coaxing a damaged aircraft across open water, watching fuel consumption, monitoring engine temperatures on the 3 remaining engines, and hoping, always hoping, that the landing gear would extend when needed. The radio operator, Technical Sergeant Joseph Bremen, maintained contact with air-sea rescue services. If they ditched in the channel, rescue would be available within 30 minutes. Behind Murphy in the waist section, Sergeant Hayes and Private Carmichael moved through the fuselage, surveying the damage in daylight for the first time. Hayes counted holes methodically, marking them on a piece of paper he'd found. He lost count at 247 and gave up. Some of the holes were the size of a fist. Others were clean punctures from rifle-caliber bullets. Sunlight streamed through several of them, illuminating dust motes in the air. The fact that the structure hadn't given way, that the fuselage remained pressurised, relatively speaking, that the entire assembly hadn't simply disintegrated from the vibration and stress. It all seemed impossible. When the white cliffs of Dover appeared on the horizon, a cheer went up through the intercom. Bailout wasn't necessary. They would land. But as Murphy began his descent toward Bassingbourn Air Base in Cambridgeshire, the landing gear warning light illuminated. The right landing gear hadn't extended. Murphy cycled the hydraulic selector to manual backup, a procedure designed for exactly this scenario. Slowly, the right gear descended. It locked into place, barely. The nose gear extended normally. Murphy circled the airfield once, dropping flaps incrementally, watching his airspeed bleed off. The landing was rough. Yankee Doodle hit the runway hard, bounced, then settled. The right landing gear held, though Murphy could feel it shudder under the impact. They rolled out safely, smoking number 3 engine still trailing black residue into the English sky. On the ground, as the crew exited the bomber, maintenance personnel were already photographing the damage. Senior mechanic Earl Stevens climbed into the fuselage and began cataloguing holes. He would eventually count 521 bullet and cannon shell penetrations. The number 3 engine was destroyed. The number 4 engine required complete overhaul. The skin damage alone would require weeks of patchwork. Yet within 60 days, remarkably fast for the era, Yankee Doodle would fly again. By that time, reports of the day's mission had begun circulating through RAF Fighter Command and back to American Air Intelligence. A B-17 had taken over 500 hits and returned. Not only returned, but successfully completed its bombing run. The implications were profound. While Luftwaffe pilots were struggling to understand how such a thing was possible, American commanders were already drawing conclusions. The B-17 wasn't just a bomber, it was proof that industrial design could overcome raw firepower. In Berlin, as these reports reached Luftwaffe headquarters, the psychological toll began to mount. By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots faced a crisis that no amount of tactical innovation could solve. They were winning individual engagements, shooting down American bombers at a rate that should have decimated the 8th Air Force. Yet the bombers kept coming. More troubling, the bombers that survived their attacks kept flying back to England to be repaired and flown again. For a fighter pilot trained in the classical traditions of air combat, this was psychologically devastating. Hauptmann Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated fighter aces, documented his observations in personal correspondence. Galland had achieved his status through superior tactics and marksmanship. He understood the art of killing aircraft. Yet in his reports from mid-1943, he described an almost surreal frustration. German fighters were achieving hits that, by every principle of aeronautical engineering, should have resulted in aircraft losses. Instead, they faced a bomber force that seemed to improve rather than degrade with each encounter. The problem was compounded by American tactics. The B-17 and B-24 formations flew in tight defensive boxes, mutually supporting each other with crossfire that made individual fighter attacks extraordinarily dangerous. A German pilot who committed fully to an attack on one bomber was exposing himself to gunfire from 5 or 6 other bombers simultaneously. Loss rates among German fighter units escalated dramatically. In June 1943 alone, JG-1 and JG-26, 2 of the most experienced fighter wings in the Luftwaffe, lost 43 pilots killed or missing. Many were experienced veterans irreplaceable in the strategic calculus of air warfare. In the barracks at Wevelgem Airfield, Lieutenant Klaus Hoffmann sat with his wingman, Feldwebel Hans Becker, drinking Wiekersatz coffee and discussing what they'd witnessed. Hoffmann's FW-190 was still in the maintenance hangar, undergoing repairs from the damage sustained 4 weeks earlier. Becker, who had flown 3 combat missions that week alone, leaned forward with the hollow eyes of a man running on stimulants and adrenaline. "They're not human, Klaus," Becker said quietly. "The machines, the American machines, they're not built the way ours are. I put 30 rounds through one yesterday. 30 rounds from my cannon. The left wing was hanging by a thread, and it still made it back across the channel." Hoffmann nodded. He'd heard similar stories from pilots across multiple squadrons. Some were undoubtedly exaggerated. Men under stress sometimes saw what they expected to see. But enough reports came from reliable, experienced pilots that a pattern emerged. The Americans had engineered their bombers to survive what German bombers could not. The strategic implications began to dawn on Luftwaffe command. If fighter attacks alone couldn't stop the bombing campaign, then the entire air defence strategy required fundamental revision. German engineers scrambled to develop new tactics and weapons. Some suggested ramming, deliberately crashing into bombers to bring them down. Others proposed upgrading fighter armament with heavier cannons, 30mm and even 37mm weapons that could tear through the B-17's aluminum skin with near certainty. Still others advocated for concentrating fighter forces into massed swarms that would overwhelm American escort fighters through sheer numerical superiority. But there was a deeper issue, one that couldn't be solved through engineering or tactics. Morale among German fighter pilots began a slow, inexorable decline. In July 1943, a fighter pilot named Hauptmann Hayo Hermann proposed a radical solution: night bombing of American bomber bases using modified single-engine fighters. The theory was that by striking the bombers on the ground, German fighters could avoid the defensive firepower that made daylight combat so lethal. High Command approved the concept, and Operation Mahmut began. For a brief period, German night fighters achieved surprising success, destroying dozens of B-17s parked on English airfields. But it was a desperate measure, born of desperation. The fundamental problem remained. American industrial capacity was producing bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them, and those bombers were surviving combat at rates that German air defence calculations had deemed impossible. By August 1943, pilot fatigue reports from German fighter units indicated something alarming. Experienced pilots were developing what might be called anticipatory defeat. They flew their missions, attacked the bombers, achieved hits, watched the bombers continue on, and returned to base knowing their efforts had failed. The psychological effect was cumulative. Pilots who had entered the war with confidence in their superiority began questioning whether any amount of skill or courage could overcome the fundamental material advantages the Americans possessed. In intelligence summaries circulated through RAF Fighter Command and back to American 8th Air Force headquarters, analysts noted the pattern. German fighter pilot aggression was declining. Not through lack of opportunity, the bombers were as vulnerable as ever, but through a kind of spiritual exhaustion. The pilots were beginning to lose faith that they could win. Meanwhile, the B-17 crews, men like Murphy, Chen, Rodriguez and Hayes, knew nothing of this psychological collapse. They only knew that on the next mission, there would be more flak, more fighters, more holes in the fuselage, and yet the bombers would return. That knowledge, reinforced mission after mission, became its own form of psychological warfare. The Americans didn't need to kill more German fighters, they only needed to survive. And the B-17 had been designed, engineered and built to do exactly that. The strategic bombing campaign over Germany was never intended to be a quick victory. American planners understood from the beginning that they were engaged in a war of industrial attrition, a grinding contest where the side with superior production capacity and the willingness to accept losses would ultimately prevail. The B-17, with its legendary durability, became the physical embodiment of that strategy. But durability came at a price, and that price was measured in human lives. Between April and September 1943, the 8th Air Force flew 1,622 heavy bomber sorties against German targets. The campaign was designed to degrade Nazi war production, cripple the Luftwaffe, and prepare the way for eventual invasion. It achieved some of these objectives. It also resulted in the loss of 402 bombers and nearly 4,000 aircrew members, killed, missing, or captured. The survivors bore witness to losses that would have broken lesser air forces. Second Lieutenant Murphy flew 17 more missions after April 17th. On his 8th mission, over Regensburg, his formation was intercepted by a Luftwaffe fighter wing so large that the sky itself seemed to darken with aircraft. Yankee Doodle took devastating cannon fire that day. The bombardier, Captain Teagle, was killed by shrapnel. The tail gunner, Rodriguez, suffered severe frostbite when the pressurization system failed. Yet the bomber completed its bombing run and returned to England. Rodriguez would recover, though he never flew again. Teagle's body was buried in the American cemetery near Cambridge. On his 12th mission, over Bremen again, the same target as April 17th, Murphy watched a FW 190 put a 20mm cannon shell directly through the No. 2 engine. The engine seized immediately, then caught fire. Murphy feathered the prop and activated the fire suppression system, but the flames continued. With 2 engines damaged and 1 on fire, Murphy made the decision to abort the bomb run and head for the coast. His crew made it back to England with barely 30 minutes of fuel remaining. As they touched down at Bassingbourn, the No. 2 engine finally stopped burning. The landing gear held. Yankee Doodle would be repaired again. But not all bombers returned. Staff Sergeant Bill Chen's ball turret on another bomber, Liberty Bell, took a direct cannon hit during a mission to Hamburg in July. Chen was killed instantly. His small compartment turned into a coffin of twisted aluminum. The pilot, seeing the turret damaged beyond recognition and receiving no response on the intercom, continued the mission. The rest of the crew never learned exactly when Chen died, only that he was gone. When Liberty Bell landed at Bassingbourn, the ground crew approached the ball turret with dread. They found Chen's body still in position, frozen in the turret's extreme cold, his hands still gripping the gun triggers. These were the human costs that rarely appeared in the strategic planning documents. The B-17's ability to absorb damage meant that crews could survive impacts that would kill the crews of German bombers. But survival didn't always mean living. Some crews bailed out over Germany and spent the rest of the war in POW camps. Some were captured after crash landing in occupied territory. Some simply vanished, their bombers going down so quickly that no one survived to report what happened. By autumn 1943, the cumulative effect of attrition had become visible in the composition of bomb groups. The veteran crews, men like Murphy who had completed multiple tours, were being rotated home or promoted to staff positions. In their place came replacements, younger, less experienced pilots fresh from training. These replacements flew with a kind of gallant fatalism. They understood statistically that their chances of completing 25 missions, the requirement to rotate home, were marginal. Yet they flew anyway, because the mission demanded it. The German fighters, for their part, had adapted to the challenge. By September 1943, Luftwaffe fighter wings were concentrating their forces into massed attacks designed to saturate American defensive firepower. Instead of individual fighters making runs on bombers, entire squadrons would attack simultaneously, pouring cannon fire and machine gun rounds into the formation. The tactic was brutally effective. Bomber losses began climbing sharply. In one particularly devastating encounter over Bremen in October, an American bomb group lost 17 of 36 bombers in a single day. Yet even with these mounting losses, the American bombing campaign continued. And critically, the bombers kept coming back. Damaged B-17s would return to their bases, be repaired by maintenance crews working around the clock, and be refueled and rearmed for the next day's mission. The Germans, by contrast, had no comparable repair and replacement infrastructure. When a German fighter was damaged, it went into the repair depot for weeks. When a German pilot was killed, he was replaced by a less experienced flyer. The attrition mathematics favoured the Americans, slowly but inexorably. In intelligence briefings at 8th Air Force headquarters, American commanders noted with grim satisfaction that German fighter pilot aggression was declining not because pilots were becoming more cautious, but because there simply weren't enough experienced pilots left to lead the attacks. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, one pilot, one fighter at a time. Hoffman, the lieutenant who had attacked Yankee Doodle on April 17th, would fly until November 1943, when his FW-190 was hit by fire from an American escort fighter during a bomber interception over Bremen. He bailed out successfully and parachuted into German territory. But his combat flying days were over. Injuries sustained during the ejection left him unable to pass medical certification. He would spend the rest of the war in a training role, never again experiencing the clarity and purpose of combat. By year's end, the 8th Air Force had flown over 4,000 bomber sorties. It had lost nearly 1,000 bombers and 10,000 aircrew members. German air defence had inflicted catastrophic losses on the American bombing force. Yet the campaign had succeeded in degrading German aircraft production and forcing the Luftwaffe to commit resources to home defence that would be desperately needed elsewhere. And the B-17, damaged, patched, repaired and flying again, had proven itself to be more than just a machine. It had become a symbol of American industrial capacity and determination. It had become proof that engineering and courage, combined with superior production, could overcome even the most determined resistance. The B-17 Flying Fortress flew its last combat mission on April 25, 1945, just days before Germany's unconditional surrender. By that date, over 12,700 B-17s had been produced. Approximately 4,750 were lost in combat or to accident, a loss rate that should have been unsustainable. Yet the American aircraft industry continued producing replacement bombers faster than they could be destroyed. The mathematics of industrial warfare had proven decisive. In the years immediately following the war, the Luftwaffe pilots who had faced the B-17 were debriefed by American intelligence officers. Their testimonies, collected in interrogation reports and personal interviews, consistently emphasized the same point. The American bombers were fundamentally different from anything the Luftwaffe had encountered. The German pilots had been trained in a military tradition that valued individual skill and tactical superiority. They had achieved brilliant tactical victories throughout the war, yet against the B-17, tactical superiority proved insufficient. Hauptmann Adolf Galland, interviewed after the war, offered a reflection that captured the essence of the air war over Germany. "We could shoot them down, yes, but we could not stop them, and that distinction cost us the war in the air." The physical evidence supported this assessment. Post-war analysis of recovered B-17s revealed the extraordinary structural redundancy built into the design. Engineers who examined battle-damaged examples found bombers that had continued flying with damage that should have been catastrophic. One recovered B-17 bore evidence of over 1,200 bullet holes. Another had sustained damage to all 4 engines, yet still managed to glide to a safe landing. These weren't isolated anomalies. They represented the cumulative result of tens of thousands of combat missions flown by American bomber crews. The psychological impact on German pilots had been equally significant. Post-war interviews with surviving Luftwaffe fighter pilots revealed a consistent pattern. Early confidence had given way to frustration, then to a kind of grim resignation. The pilots understood intellectually that they were flying superior aircraft and possessed superior training. Yet they faced an enemy that refused to die in the manner that enemies were supposed to die. This contradiction produced a psychological toll that no amount of tactical innovation could overcome. Second Lieutenant Murphy completed his tour of duty in January 1944 after flying 25 missions. He was rotated home to the United States, where he spent the remainder of the war training new bomber pilots. Yankee Doodle continued flying under other pilots and crews until the end of the war in Europe. The bomber survived 140 combat missions, one of the longest-serving B-17s in the 8th Air Force. After the war, it was flown to the Arizona desert and scrapped for aluminum. But not all B-17s met that fate. Several were preserved as memorials to the men who flew them. The most famous, the Memphis Belle, which had flown alongside Yankee Doodle on numerous missions, was restored and preserved as a flying museum. When it returned to the air decades later, crowds gathered to witness the sight of the old bomber flying once more. For many of those who watched, the sight carried profound emotional weight. These machines represented not just military history, but the sacrifice of an entire generation. The strategic impact of the B-17 campaign extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories. The bombing campaign had degraded German aircraft production, forced the Luftwaffe to commit resources to home defence, and ultimately contributed to the liberation of occupied Europe. Yet the cost had been staggering. Nearly 47,000 American bomber crews were killed in the strategic bombing campaign over Europe and Germany. Tens of thousands more were captured and spent years in German POW camps. The losses inflicted by the Luftwaffe were severe enough that the American air commander, General Karl Spaatz, questioned whether the bombing campaign could continue. Yet it did continue, because the B-17 made continuation possible. The bomber's legendary durability meant that crews who survived their missions could fly again. The aircraft's structural integrity meant that damage, however severe, could often be repaired. And the American industrial base meant that replacement bombers could be produced to compensate for losses. This combination, aircraft design, industrial capacity, and crew courage, proved to be an unstoppable force. In the decades following the war, military historians would debate the efficiency of the strategic bombing campaign. Some argued that the resources devoted to bombing Germany would have been better spent elsewhere. Others contended that the campaign had been essential to breaking German military capacity and hastening the war's end. What remained undisputed was the central role played by the B-17. Without the fortress's ability to absorb punishment and continue flying, the bombing campaign would have been impossible. For the American crews who flew them, the B-17 represented something more than just an aircraft. It represented the possibility of survival in an environment designed to kill them. Every bullet hole, every patch of sheet metal, every redundant hydraulic system spoke to the engineers and planners who had built the bomber with the explicit purpose of bringing crews home alive. That mission was only partially successful. Thousands of American airmen never came home. The B-17 Flying Fortress remains, in the collective memory of World War II, an icon of American industrial might and determination. German pilots who faced it in combat never forgot the shock of watching a heavily damaged bomber continue flying when all logic suggested it should fall from the sky. That shock was, in many ways, the true victory of the B-17. Not in the battles won, but in the fundamental message it conveyed. American engineering and American courage would not be overcome.